All right, looks like we're on air. So just give it a few more seconds until the video starts showing. There's a 20-second delay, I understand, for the video to appear. Once that starts, we'll begin. Okay. All right, so let's start. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to this Introduction to Visual Studio Extensibility screencast. My name is Igal Tabachnik. I work at Particular Software, and today I'm going to do a very basic introduction to what it takes to develop Visual Studio extensions. This is going to be, I'm going to cover a very entry-level stuff. The idea behind this series of screencasts that I'm planning is that many people consider developing Visual Studio extensions to be a bit of a dark art. I would like to show you some of the improvements that were made in this area with recent releases of Visual Studio 2015 and the SDK. We'll talk about a little bit about Roslyn and stuff like that. So let's have a look at the agenda. So for the agenda, I'm going to show you what's new with the Visual Studio 2015 SDK. We will also understand something that's called custom hives. This is areas in Visual Studio that are responsible for extensions and settings. We'll see what those are. We will look at some important paths, files, and command line switches that you should know when developing Visual Studio extensions. I will also mention the difference between extensions and packages. Those are different things. They're oftentimes used interchangeably. And there's also a reserved space for Q&A. Now, this is going to be more interactive. And so if you have questions during the screencast, things that you would like to know, please ask them. And if I don't manage to see them during, I will make sure to answer them after. Okay, so for the prerequisites, you don't need to follow along, but just to make sure, you do need Visual Studio 2015 Community or better. And you need to install the Visual Studio SDK. Now, if you go to visualstudio.com, there's a maze of links that you can select from, and one of those is pointing to the Visual Studio tools or SDK or something like that. If you have MSDN, you can just search for it. It will be an installer. You can install from there. I'm not going to talk about the Roslyn SDK, but if you have that installed, for the better. Yeah, some of you might notice that this guy, his name is Mr. Tiny Face. That's for him, and I thought it would be nice having him present. And so with this, I don't really have any more slides of interest, so we'll just jump straight into the demo of sorts. So let me switch to Visual Studio. And this is an empty Visual Studio. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new extension, a new V6. So when you install the Visual Studio SDK, when you click File, New Project, and you go to under C#, you go to Extensibility, you will see those several things. Now, there used to be quite a lot more here, I believe, but the Visual Studio Extensibility team done some really nice trimming of things and just streamlined the whole experience a little bit. So what we can do is we can create a new V6 project. Now, I haven't defined what V6 is. We'll do that in just a moment. But when you create a new V6 project, this is your entry point for creating a new extension. So I'm going to just name this my first V6, and just going to create a project. Now, if you have done this before, if you have some experience with creating Visual Studio extensions, you would expect a wizard to appear here. Like I mentioned, they streamlined this experience and moved everything to project and item templates. And when you create a new V6 package, what you end up is this screen. This is essentially a V6 package that contains an index HTML file, which you can see here, that contains some information, a style sheet for that. We don't need both of them, so I'm going to delete them. And what we are left with is this file called source.extension.v6 manifest. Now, v6 manifest is kind of the heart of Visual Studio Extensions. It contains all the metadata that describes your extensions and the files that are included in that extension. So we're going to open that. Now, we can open that either with the wizard, which is quite nice, the wizard, I must admit, or we can just open this with code, and this is essentially an XML file which you can edit. But for our purposes, the wizard, the visual tool is actually quite nice. So what do we have here? First of all, we can specify the name of our V6. This is the name that will appear in the Visual Studio Gallery and in the tools, extensions, and update dialog. This is the name of our extension. The other thing is that we can put the company name or the author name of that extension. It is usually taken from if you are signed into Visual Studio, it would have your name as you signed in here, but here I'm not signed in, so I can just do anything. Let's call it brown bag, because this is a brown bag conference. And the other thing is product ID. It should be unique. It's usually comprised of the name, the author, and some random GUID. This can basically be anything, but just to make sure it is unique throughout, because this uniquely identifies your extension. So I can, for our purposes, just keep it as a GUID. This is this is quite unique in itself. Also, you can fill out the description, the language. You can put out the license file. If you browse for a file, you can add a text file or a RTF file as the license, and it will be automatically copied as a resource to the extension, to the V6. Now, I haven't yet mentioned what V6 was. V6 is an acronym for Visual Studio Installer for Extensions, and this is the unit of deployment for extensions. So the V6 is a file, which is essentially a zip file that contains all the information that you need to install the extensions, and Visual Studio can natively install them by double-clicking. So let's quickly look over a couple of more important things that you need to know about this V6 manifest. One of those is install targets. Now, install targets is an area where you define where your Visual Studio, to what Visual Studio versions your extension can be installed to. So if we double click on this specifier, or rather press edit on this specifier, here you can say what is the minimal Visual Studio version that your extension applies to. So you can, since 2013 actually, you now have the Community Edition, which is essentially a free version of the Visual Studio Professional. So if you specify Community, your extension would be applicable to Community, Pro, and Enterprise. If you specify Pro, then it will only be applicable to Pro and Enterprise. There are also a few entries here for Visual Studio Express editions. Now, you cannot install extensions to Visual Studio Express editions, but you can create project and item templates. So if you have your own kind of library, so for example, if you have an open source project like Nancy, and you would like to provide users with project templates that automatically create Nancy-ready projects, you can create project templates and you can install them in Express editions. But for our purposes, we'll remain with Community. Now, there's also something here that's called integrated shell. This is something that's rarely used, because essentially Visual Studio is a shell, which is a UI, just a UI shell with extensions. Everything in Visual Studio that you know and you can see is basically an extension that Visual Studio just composes together. It is quite possible to take just the shell, just the bare minimum of Visual Studio, and create your own IDE experience from scratch. You can create your own language services, you can create your own editors, debuggers, And some products that actually do that, and they can build an entire IDE based on Visual Studio Shell. Of course, you have to be insane to actually do that, but it is quite possible to package everything and build everything from scratch. So for our purposes, we'll remain with community. Here, also, you can specify where your extension can be installed into which versions of Visual Studio. Now, you can multi-target your extensions to different versions of Visual Studio. Here, by default, it specifies that this extension will only be installed into version 14, which is Visual Studio 2015. You can use the NuGet version specifier. This is some sort of a range specifier that says if you add a comma here, then this would mean that this version can be installed in all versions starting from 2015 onwards. And if you want to know the full syntax, as I usually have to look it up, just Google v6 range specifier, version range specifier, and you will find it. I usually just Google for it because I can never remember it by heart. There's also two more checkboxes here that should be aware of. One of them says that this v6 is installed for all users. This means that A, your extension requires elevation to be installed, and B, this will be placed for all the users on the machine. We will later see how exactly that works. And the other one is the checkbox that specifies that this v6 is installed by Visual Studio Installer. What this means is that this checkbox instructs Visual Studio that the installation and removal of this extension is managed by an external installer. And so, for example, if you have things like that are installed externally with MSI, such as Oscode and ReSharper and NCrunch, so you will not be able to disable or uninstall them from within Visual Studio. This is because they have this checkbox set. This means that you will only have to go to add remove programs and install it from there or change it from there. With this, I'm going to quickly jump into skip assets for the moment and jump into dependencies. This also tells you what your package dependent on. Usually, you would leave it at default. So it says that your package is dependent on the .NET framework version. But what you can also do is you can add additional dependencies, and those dependencies can be other extensions installed in Visual Studio. So let's say you have an extension that depends on other extension. For example, your extension depends on the Roslyn language service. So you can select installed extension and look for code analysis. So if your target Visual Studio doesn't have code analysis, the installation will fail. So this is how you can have dependencies between extensions if you want. So with this, there's not too many things that we can still look at here. But now, let's just simply build and run this. So I'm going to simply build this project, and I'm going to press F5 and run it. And let's see what happens. So as you can see, this is basically an empty project that just contains the v6 manifest file. And let me press F5 to make sure that this runs. And I have build errors. This was not part of the... Oh boy. Give me a second. Let me try this again. There's obviously something going on here. My second v6. Give me a moment, because I probably did something wrong. So I'm going to just remove this and this. And I'm not going to change anything. So I'm just going to press F5, and let's see what happens. So when I press F5, what will happen is I have a few monitors, and let's hope that let's hope it opens here. You can see that right now I have another instance of Visual Studio open, and this one has a slightly different theme. This is another instance of Visual Studio, but you will notice that it is black, and also here at the top you see that it says experimental instance. Now, I will address what those are, what this is in just a moment. But for now, I would like you to know that with our empty V6 that we didn't add anything to yet, when I pressed F5, what Visual Studio did was package it in a V6 file, install it into this so-called experimental instance. And we can see that if we go to extensions and updates, we can now see that, well, my first V6 is here, but also my second V6 is right here. So this is, you can see that it was created by company because I created a new one without changing. You see the first one was created by Brown Bag, which means this dialog reads all the metadata from the V6 and displays it right here. So before going further, I would like to explain what this experimental instance is and where did it come from. You will notice that this is a different looking Visual Studio instance to my own. So to understand what experimental instance is, I need to explain to you what Visual Studio hives are. Now, in Visual Studio, it is possible. It is built for multi-tenancy, which means that you can use different profiles, if you will, of Visual Studio for your work. If we open the Visual Studio Developer command prompt, which is essentially a command prompt with just some environment variables for Visual Studio configured, then if we type devenv, which is the name of the Visual Studio executable file, and we add something that's called root suffix, anything we put after this root suffix is going to create a separate environment of Visual Studio with this name. So essentially, I can basically clone all the settings of Visual Studio, kind of start a brand new copy of Visual Studio, if you will, which will be completely isolated from my main one. So for instance, if I type in devenv root suffix hello, what will happen is I will now, you will see that it disappeared, but you will see that right now Visual Studio says, it shows me the welcome dialog. I'm going to click not now. Now it asks me to select a theme. I'm going to select like a light theme and maybe just select Visual Studio F# development settings. So now what happened was Visual Studio created, and I'm not sure where it went. The demo gods are not with me today. I'm not sure where my second instance of Visual Studio went. Let me launch it again. I think I might have closed it by mistake. But what just now happened was, yeah, there you can see it. I now have a brand new instance of Visual Studio, which is ready for F# development. And it is completely separate from my my original one. So basically what I can do is I can go and come on. And I can completely modify it in any way that I want. I can change the theme, I can go into fonts and colors, and I can make it Comic Sans if I want. Let's actually do that, because why not? So have you developed with Comic Sans before? So right now I can start a new project, and you will see that it will probably automatically choose Visual F# as the default language. Some people would be happy about that, and but just to troll them, you can see that my font, my default font is now Comic Sans, and we will keep it that way. So let's try and understand what exactly happened. When I type root suffix hello, there are a couple of things that are happening into the registry editor to see them. But if you open regedit and you go to current user, software, Microsoft, Visual Studio, see I had it open, then what you will see is that I have a bunch of folders here that are corresponding to the major version of Visual Studio. So for instance, Visual Studio 2015 means is version 14. But you'll see I have a bunch of folders here with the suffix, with a certain suffix. So this is essentially what the root suffix command does. It creates a completely separate environment, completely separate entries in the registry for the suffix. So this means you can basically work in isolation. So you can have um, settings for Visual Studio that are completely not interfering with your main one. So if you see, I have hello here. I have also hello config, which is the place where all the configurations of Visual Studio are stored. And notice that I have here something that's called exp. Now, exp by default is just another hive, another Visual Studio hive that was created for me when I initially executed the extension that I created. And the exp corresponds to the experimental instance. So it is essentially just another hive for Visual Studio with its own separate settings. There's also a flag somewhere here that says that if the name of the experimental instance is exp, then add the words experimental instance on top. But what I can see is, let me close this new Visual Studio instance. But what I can see, if I go to the properties of my extension, then if I go to debug, what you will see is that my Visual Studio extension is programmed to start the devenv command with the root suffix exp, arguments. So this is how essentially Visual Studio installs itself into, my extensions install itself into the Visual Studio hive. I really have no idea what's going on here. This is not supposed to happen. Let me try and start this again, just for the sake of, so I'm using actually a hive to demonstrate this. So let me just do a root suffix demo, because this is the name of my hive. Okay, and let me open my second v6. You have to trust me that when I've done this several times before, it just worked and I didn't have any errors, but you know, demo gods are not as favorable to me as they usually are. So this was initialized. Let me press F5. Hopefully everything will work. Oh my God! I think I know what this might be. This might be the extensions cache. So please don't look for a second. I'm actually going to where Visual Studio actually installs these extensions, which is here in the exp. This is actually another location on the disk where your settings are duplicated, so you can see that they are isolated from each other. Let me make sure that I'm going to delete those two, and I'm going to delete also the model cache. And so now if I rebuild, oh boy, this is nuts. Okay, so let me just create a third one, my third v6, and just move on. So believe me that those issues are not supposed to be here. I think I might have not cleaned up the demo before. Not cleaned up the demo before I started doing this. But let's actually see what we can do with the Visual Studio extension, and to get to the most important part of this demo. So you can see, you saw how Visual Studio creates hives. Now, if we click on the extension and we go to add a new item, if we go to the where's my extensibility? Nothing works today. There should be an extensibility here. Let me do a class. Oh boy. Should have been extensibility here. Now I don't want to stop this recording to try and created a v6. I'm in the framework. Let's create 4.6. I don't know. Maybe they changed something again. I'm not even going to rename. Let me just add a new item. And I don't see my extensibility. It should be here. Lastly, let me maybe try switching to 4.5.2. Maybe they're somehow constrained by the versions. Okay, if that's not going to work, I think I'm going to Now, let me look for adornment. No, it's not here. So for some reason or other, the items that I need are just not here. And unfortunately, that's kind of preventing me from continue because the things that I need to show you are related to to some of the automation, but something must have happened to my environment. I'm sorry for the screw up. Yeah, I'm going to try and reset. Yeah, it's actually I'm going to try and just do a whole setup, but I do need an elevation for this. So you will see me in my actual environment. Let me restart as admin. I'm using as my main console. I'm using the ConEmu thing, which also has this cool Quake-like. Sliding, which I like. So let me do a dev I actually do need to specify the root suffix demo, and I'm going to do a setup. This is basically a setup is a command I wanted to run at the end because to explain to explain this to you at the end, because this is one of those commands that you should be aware of. It will take a moment. What I'm basically now doing is I'm completely rebuilding all my Visual Studio settings for that specific Hive. So it's going to go and re-register all the extensions and will reapply all the settings from scratch. Essentially, right now this is building those directories in the registry that you've seen. Right now, what it did was simply delete those and rebuild them from scratch. This is, by the way, the reason why you should not, why you shouldn't manually change anything in the registry, because every time somebody might run a setup, it will disappear. So I'm going to start Visual Studio again, and because I'm in an elevated prompt, this will be an administrative version, but I don't care about that right now. Let me try and open the third V6 again, and hopefully I am able to now go to add new item, and god damn it, it's not here. I might need to install. Oh boy, I know why. I'm sorry, I know why this is. I know why this happened. I'm using a pre-release. I'm using an RC. I'm using an RC build of Visual Studio. There's no SDK for this. I haven't I haven't installed the necessary SDK for this. Oh boy. Okay, so this is what happens with the live. Let's cut this this presentation short. We will erase it from existence, and we'll try this again next time. I promise it will be much better next time. So with this, allow me to just God, allow me to just stop the presentation and actually, you know what? Let's salvage at least some of this. So let me just quickly summarize. Do you remember how in the beginning I said that the prerequisites for this are Visual Studio SDK? Well, I needed to make sure that I have the SDK installed. I actually didn't. So I'm not sure how I had the project templates, but it definitely turns out that I also need to have the SDK for the rest of the things. So this is completely my fault, and I'm going to make it up for you next time, I promise. So right now, let's just go to the summary, because there are some important things that you should know when developing extensions. So first of all, Visual Studio is contrary to what just happened here, Visual Studio is quite powerful and extensible. I haven't managed to show you, but just from your experience, plugins such as ReSharper and Crunch and everything else in the Visual Studio gallery just show you how it is possible to extend Visual Studio. You can just basically do more or less whatever it is you want. You can add your own menus, you can add your own dialogues, you can flag certain elements in the code in special fonts and colors. All of these things you can do with extensions. Of course, you need to know how to do those things, but this is why There are many open source Visual Studio extensions to learn from. And it's actually a community right now of extension writers, including people from Microsoft that hang out on the Gitter VS Extensibility channel. And it's always possible to ask them, and just you will get an answer, because very smart people hang out there. So just so you know, Visual Studio contains the notion of hives. Hives are basically separate entities, separate environments for Visual Studio that you can use. What I personally used for this demo is that I used a hive called demo, which is something that I use often for presentations. It is my clean Visual Studio environment, which is separate from my main one, in which I can customize the fonts. I can make the fonts bigger. This is so I don't have to go and reset my Visual Studio every time I do a presentation. If you show up, if you do some demos on your own personal machine often, and you don't want to keep resetting it, use the root suffix anything, just to create yourself an environment which is completely separate from the main one, which you can customize. Now, couple of things about extensions and where they are installed. So extensions can be installed per machine. And when they are installed per machine, they are A, require elevation, and B, they are located in this path called VS root dir common 7 ID extensions. If we browse to that, I have this. I did have this folder open, but if we go to program files, Microsoft Visual Studio 14, common 7 IDE, and extensions. Here you will have a list of all the extensions that are installed per machine. And this means that they will be available in every hive of Visual Studio that you launch. This is the main kind of place that the per machine extensions exist. And there are some like, for example, ncrunch is here, so it will be automatically available in every hive. But notice that most of the names for the extensions are mangled 8.3 names. So they are random 8 characters dot 3 characters names. And some of those folders are even empty. But the reason those are, well, the excuse that those are randomly named is that I actually asked this once. I asked this once on Stack Overflow, and the answer is that so people do not rely on the paths where extensions are installed. People do not hard code any names into the extensions, and so they are portable. They could be roamed, and they could be installed on different machines in different environments. And you should not hard code any company names or extension names into your own extension, and use some other techniques to find out where you are. Visual Studio provides you a lot of these things in form of APIs, finding out where you are located. So those are the per machine extensions. There's also, we briefly saw this, there's a per hive extension location, and those are located in the local app data. So this is your local app data there. If you go to Microsoft Visual Studio and select the version, or actually the hive, you will also have the extensions folder here. And this is, for example, a hive I have that only has the ReSharper installation in it. So you can see that JetBrains ReSharper is here, and some other thing. The Azure Cloud Explorer, of course, I must have it all the time. So this is the per hive location, and those do not require elevation when you install them. So there was a question earlier, is why would I install extensions from Windows installer instead of the V6 installer? And the answer is that V6 installer is basically a zip file, just a zip file, and when Visual Studio installs it for you, it is basically doing an extract, and that's it. So there's no pre and post operations you can do with the V6. So V6 is just an Xcopy deployment, if you will. Sometimes if you have a more complex extension and that you need to do some additional operations, such as running nggen or registering things in the registry, or just do any other manipulations, you cannot do this from a V6, and then you have to kind of either do this from a custom installer, And then, and so this is one of the reasons. And the other reason is that if you really want to install your extension files anywhere else, you have a branding preference and you want to install them not in any one of these locations, but into a custom location, and then you want to point Visual Studio to look at that custom location, you'll also have to do this from the V6 the MSI installer as well. So unfortunately, we didn't see how Visual Studio detects and loads extensions, but this is how. Essentially, the V6 manifest file tells Visual Studio where to look for the extension and load it. So as long as it sees the V6 manifest file, it knows that it's an extension and it will attempt to load all of its files. Another thing, so the last thing that you should be aware of are those useful command line switches. One of them was setup, which you saw me perform. Setup basically tells Visual Studio, okay, take the entire environment that you have, nuke it, and rebuild it from scratch. This is the nuclear options, usually most offered ones when you have problems with Visual Studio. You will be mostly asked to do a setup. This is mostly a non-destructive operation because it will simply rebuild all of your existing settings from scratch. But sometimes it can produce problems. If setup ends up prematurely or something happens, you might end up with a non-functioning Visual Studio, and you get a lot of errors when you're trying to start it. And also setup requires elevation. And so use this as the last option. If your Visual Studio is misbehaving, you're seeing some error dialogues, try to run setup first, see if that goes away. Another switch is something that's called reset skip packages. And it is very important that in case you have those errors, this will be usually a Visual Studio telling you, I was unable to load this and this extension. Would you like me to disable trying to load it in the future? And you will say yes, trying to make this error message go away. And then the next time and all the subsequent times, your Visual Studio will not even attempt to load this package, even if you run setup. So what this switch does is it tells Visual Studio to reset the list of skipped packages. And this is how you can force Visual Studio to try again. One more switch is safe mode, which is a switch that tells Visual Studio do not load any of the third-party extensions, just load with the bare minimum, just to see if your installation is still valid. So it will try to load the bare minimum of the environment. It is almost not usable, but at the very least you will know if your Visual Studio possibly can be salvaged in case of something going wrong. If not, if safe mode doesn't work, you most probably want to just reinstall your Visual Studio. Finally, there's an undocumented, well, it now became documented with some open source documentation that Microsoft did on GitHub. This switch says update configuration. What it basically tells Visual Studio to do is, instead of rebuilding all the settings from scratch as you do with the setup option, it will tell Visual Studio to just refresh its own caches the next time Visual Studio starts. First of all, this operation is safe because this is essentially what installing V6 packages does. Because I'll remind you that V6 package is a zip file, and when you install something from the gallery, you will usually need to restart your Visual Studio. This is because what the installation does, it copies the V6 files to the correct location, but it needs Visual Studio to update itself in order for the extension to be installed. So this is what the switch does. It instructs Visual Studio to update its extensions cache the next time it restarts. So first of all, you don't need elevation for this. Second, this completes immediately. You don't have to wait for setup to complete. And it is much safer than doing setup because this is essentially what V6 does. So if V6 installer, the gallery installer itself, does this, you can do it yourself. We didn't get, unfortunately, the chance to see it, but I want you to know that all the extensions in Visual Studio are composed with MEF. All the extensions in Visual Studio have some sort of MEF metadata on top of them. They're either importing or exporting settings. And the Visual Studio is basically a huge MEF container. and it loads and discovers those your extensions as catalogs, uh, and this is how it composes them. One of the most common troubleshooting areas where you try to install an extension and it doesn't work is that you forgot to add to mark your extension as a MEF export. And I would have shown this to you because the SDK, the 2015 SDK handles it for you now. You don't really have to do it manually, but unfortunately, due to this error that I have, not having the SDK, we didn't get the chance to see that. I will make it up to you, I promise. Um, Finally, you can target multiple versions of Visual Studio with a single extension. The Visual Studio team does great support for versioning the SDK packages, so you can be guaranteed that features that existed in earlier versions of Visual Studio will be backwards compatible and forwards compatible. And Visual Studio provides its own binding redirects. So, for instance, if you build build against the 2013 SDK, and you use the SDK DLLs, the published and the documented ones, you will most probably be able to run your extension as is in Visual Studio 2015 SDK, because it will take care of loading the correct DLL version for you. Finally, about Roslyn, I just want to mention that Roslyn analyzers are using the exact same MEF model. So if whereas extensions are exposing themselves as MEF components and they are absorbed and composed with Visual Studio, Roslyn analyzers and code fixes are also exposed with MEF. They have their own special attributes, but they will be processed by the Roslyn service during your execution. And this is why Roslyn analyzers can also be deployed as VSIX packages, but also as NuGet packages. There's a special handling for analyzers in NuGet. So you can package them either as VSIX and or NuGet packages. So unfortunately, most of my demo did not work, which is sadly the case, because I was very excited to show how easy it was to to actually do some of the things in Visual Studio 2015 SDK. But unfortunately, I'm one step ahead of everybody, and I'm using I'm using an unreleased software on my machine, which unfortunately means I didn't have the up-to-date SDK. I will try and do the session again in the future, so that I can show exactly. I can show you all the cool parts that we didn't get the chance to see. Yeah, so unfortunately, I don't really have anything else to add, because we did skip most of the very important things. I will try to address just a couple of questions that were here. And so Mordecai asked if I can do some of the things with the PowerShell script. So the things being, probably doing some post-installation things. You can, but only if your Visual Studio starts up. So essentially, if you deploy an extension, it needs to be configured. Visual Studio needs to be told that the extension was installed. It needs to start this extension up, and then you also need to manually kind of invoke all your post-installation scripts. Now, two problems with that. First, you have to manually invoke those things. VSIX will not do it for you. And B, most probably you are running without elevation, because Visual Studio, you're almost never run it as an administrator unless you deal with some old version of IIS or something like that requires those things. And so if you need to do some things that require elevation, you will not be able to run them from within Visual Studio, because it will not run as an elevated process. And also, it is not a very great experience that you have to do additional installations while you supposedly installed an extension. And correct me if I'm wrong, the entity framework is a NuGet package, and the NuGet package kind of has this functionality built in. So it does support running PowerShell scripts before and after installations. But also in NuGet version 3, I believe that this functionality is going away. PowerShell is a very bad experience doing some operations. They cannot be transactioned. They cannot be really rolled back. So Installing things with PowerShell are rarely good for the experience and the stability of your end users. So if you really have to do something special, you should probably use MSI installers, um, either with the Wix or just whatever it is. Um, at this point, I will finish this screencast, and I'm going to go through the comments. And if I missed something, I'm going to address them in a separate blog post that will follow this. Again, my apologies for the demo failing on me, and I will see how I can fix this in the future. I'll make absolutely sure that those things worked before before attempting to demo them. Again, I'm really sorry for taking your time, but I still hope that it was at least somewhat educational, and you did manage to get something out of this presentation. And I will see you in the next ones. And for now, I will stop and say goodbye and have a nice day.